MedTech sector, so I've actually updated recently this number. So although they are a couple of years old, but we are talking about $450 billion as market size worldwide. From 2000 and from a few years earlier was up to a good bit at more than 10%, about 15 or 20%. But you see that the estimated growth percentage is about 5.5 in a year. So yes, given that the previous values of about 400 billions was in 2016, that kind of matches the predictions. And there is an investment of $31 billion in technology and R&D in this market. So it's quite substantial. We're talking about roughly 10%. Now, you have to consider here that this includes both manufacturing industry and development, and of course, companies that can do a little bit of both. So how is this broken down? Of course, as you can imagine, the majority of it is in the US or North America, if you want to include Canada. So it's about half, slightly below half of the total revenue. And the rest is kind of distributed evenly between Europe and Asia Pacific, so East Asia. And then, of course, we have a little bit of other regions, including countries from the BRIC group that are growing, both in terms of demand, but also in terms of companies that come from this country and trying to enter the other markets. Bottom line is that it's a very large market. It's growing, it will keep on growing, and it's very profitable. Now, the risks are high, but the revenue, the potential revenues and the potential gains are considerably high. What is a medical device? This is the definition taken from the MDR, the medical device regulation in Europe. But without going through all of it, what I want to highlight are the words that are marked in bold. So it's an instrument, apparatus, appliance, software, implant, reagent, or material that is used, and these are the key words, for the diagnosis, prevention, monitor, prediction, prognosis, treatment, or alleviation of a disease, injury, disability, or for investigation, replace, modification of the anatomy, or a physiological or pathological process of state. Or it is an IVD, so it is an in vitro diagnostic device. And this is the last bullet point. All of this, a device that does not achieve this action by pharmacological, immunological, or metabolic means. So basically, it is not a drug, or the primary component is not a drug. So for example, if you're talking about pre-filled syringes, it could be under a combination device, or in some cases actually considered the syringe itself, you consider like the packaging of the injectable that is inside it. So it could actually be considered differently. So key points are that if it is a medical device, if it does one of these things, it is a medical device and you have to treat it as such. If it doesn't do any of these things, it's not a medical device and you can't make it a medical device, okay? There are cases where the situation is borderline, where it could be easy enough to push this product into a medical device or not a medical device, depending on what you claim, depending on what you write in terms of what this device can do. But in general, the situation is typically pretty black and white. If it does something to a medical device, you have to market it as a medical device. But then, of course, it means that it has to undergo and it has to be subject to all the regulations and the standards that are applicable. The type of medical device, there is a wide variety of medical devices, from very complex, like pacemaker, very high risk, to very simple, like tongue depressors. So again, the complexity here is not a factor in determining what a medical device is. There are devices that are very simple with very low risk, but are still medical devices. And of course, there are devices that can be very complex. But at the same time, there are very complex devices that are not necessarily medical devices, that are just supporting tools. Now, let's give a look at the regulatory framework. This is what we are going to give a look at the moment. So we're talking about North America, Europe, China, Japan, Australia, and Brazil. How are they? These are the main markets, but how are these? What are the regulations that are applicable to each of these countries or areas, and why? And how do you actually comply to them? So first of all, and we're talking about the authority. So from the legal standpoint, you have to comply to the local laws. That's it. And these laws are enforced by different, of course, different offices or different authorities, depending on the country that we're talking about. And of course, they have a jurisdiction only within that country or within that group of countries. So in Canada, you have Health Canada. In the US, you have the FDA, and Visa in Brazil, competent authorities in Europe. Then you have TGIA in Australia, PMDA in Japan, and NMPA in China, the one that used to be the China FDA. So each one, typically, it's country related. So the FDA can't say anything about Canada, Health Canada can say anything about the FDA. Europe is a slightly different scenarios where we have these competent authorities, which are, again, they are, their jurisdiction is limited to their own country. So the one that is in the UK, okay, consider the UK is not in Europe anymore, but the one that is in Germany, the BfArM, does not have a say to what can be done in France. But there is an overlap and there is more communication and overlap of competence in Europe. So what are the laws actually that are applicable in these places? In Europe, we have the medical device regulation, or for a few more months, if applicable, the medical device directive. And these are applicable at European level, the whole European level, the whole Europe. In the US, the Code of Federal Regulation, different parts of the Code of Federal Regulations. The MDRs, the medical device regulations in Canada, the RDCs in Brazil. There are more medical device regulation in China, ministerial ordinances in Japan, and TGA in Australia. This is law. Okay, so here we are talking about, we are in the legal world, basically. And this is ultimately what a company has to comply to, because in order to market it, you have, of course, to comply to the local laws. Difference, I don't know if anybody knows, probably everybody knows, but the difference between MDRs and MDDs, although now it's not much the point anymore because the MDD is going to be discontinued very soon in May, is that the medical device directive was a European directive, meaning that the European Parliament was created this directive, and every state had to absorb this directive and transform it into local laws. It was not just a matter of translation, but it could be interpreted, it could be changed. It was a directive. The MDR, the medical device regulation, it's law as it is. So it is applicable to every single country in the European Union, bar translation. But in terms of the applicability, in terms of the content, there is very little room to maneuver in this case. And this was done on purpose as a matter of trying to uniform the requirement across Europe. Now, standards. Standards instead are different objects. They do not belong necessarily to any specific countries, though different countries can have their own, but they are international, in most cases, international standards, so they can be applied across different parts of the world. So the most common one is, of course, ISO 13485, and this is the basic, the main one, the main applicable standard, in particular for Canada, Europe, and Australia. You have then a different type of a different type of structure that has come up recently, which is called the MDSAP program. This MDSAP program was sponsored mainly by the FDA, and at the moment, the full-time members or the official members are Japan, Australia, Brazil, US, and Canada. And what is it? So, of course, you can imagine that could be particularly difficult. It still is particularly difficult for a company to market their products in different areas, in different jurisdictions, because the laws are different, because the requirements are different. The way you register a device is different. The type of approval that you require are different. And these may end up in differences in the terms of what is required in terms of, I don't know, test or characteristics or things like that in different countries. So as a starting point, there is an attempt of trying to make this requirement a bit more uniform, at least starting from the aspects of the quality system. So we talk about 13485. So this MDSAP program is called Medical Device Single Audit Program. Is the first step, because the one of the things that large company will be subject to is audits. There will be audits by, not just the notified body, but any of the competent authorities or the authorities, the agencies can come in and audit this company, and this could be very, very burdensome. And the vast majority of the requirements, the vast majority of things that they review is absolutely the same. So, as I said, sponsored mainly by the FDA, but with this other country involved, this program, which is not mandatory, you can select to use it, but it's not necessarily, except for Canada. In Canada, there is not much else that you can do if you want to enter Canada to join, other than joining the MDSAP program, where you are audited by it's not a notified body, but most notified body can do MDSAP audits in a similar fashion. They have a very specific way to create the audits and to the way to score findings and things like that. And then that certificate, when they certify you, when you pass the audit, can be used in place of other type of inspection, for example, in different places of the world, in this country. So it will alleviate the burden then to have additional audits or inspection a lot. Why? And a lot of this is based on ISO 13485, plus, of course, specific requirements of the different countries, which typically are around things like registration, post-market surveillance, field action, and things like that. But the core is based on 13485. So why is, for example, Europe outside that? Well, Europe is at the moment, together with the WHO, is an official observer. So sitting there on the fence and see how things go before moving in. The reality is probably that Europe will wait until the MDR is being absorbed to a certain extent in Europe and in the world in general before joining the MDSAP, because it is the logical thing to do, of course. Recently, I think it was mid last year, there were new countries that have joined the MDSAP program as affiliate members, and this is Argentina and South Korea. Meaning that they are not full-time members, so they don't have much say in terms of how to manage the applicability of the MDSAP program or making decisions related to the program, but they can use the results of the audit to help them in the qualification and the approval of devices and companies. So it kind of seems to be a first step before they become full-time members. Right. Wrapping up, difference between standards and regulations. This is very important, and I apologize if some of you, and I assume that some of you already know all about it. The law, you have to comply to the law. The law is country specific, first of all. It gives you the very relatively high level safety and performance principle. They're not very technical. It talks about a legal arrangement. It talks about who is in charge of these agencies, who they are, and how they should be structured. It talks about the classification of the devices, how you register fees, legal responsibilities, legal obligation, and all the post-market surveillance system. That is, of course, it depends on the different jurisdiction. Standards in general, they are developed by independent organizations typically, like ISO or IEC. They are non-country specific. Countries can adopt them, okay, with modification. So you probably have seen that there is an ISO 13485, then there is an EN ISO 13485, which means that is the European version of 13485. Now, they don't go in and change the content, but they typically put annexes, addendum, things like that, that kind of show the difference between what the standard says and what the actual rules and laws and the regulations say. They are, for example, 13485 talks about the quality system process or processes. 62304 is another quality system process, but some of them can be very technical, like 6601, for example. And they give you this presumption of conformity. What does it mean, this presumption of conformity? Which is, again, it's another important point to understand. So, again, the manufacturer has the obligation to comply with the full regulation. This is it. This is the ultimate requirement. You have to comply with the law. But countries or different jurisdictions can adopt these standards, and in Europe are called harmonized standards, in the US are called recognized consensus standards, that give you presumption of conformity. And examples are 1345 for quality for the QMS, 14971 is risk management, 6234 for medical software, and 661 for basic performance safety for medical electrical equipment. This is the most famous one, but in the EU, there are dozens of them. In the US, there are even more. There are hundreds probably of these recognized consensus standards. And what is this presumption of compliance? The presumption of compliance meaning that if you use these standards and demonstrate the compliance to the standards, and it could be with a certification, for example, for 13485, with external certification for 6601, or self-certified for 14971, 62304, then you have a presumption of compliance with that specific part of the law. So if in Europe you comply to ISO 13485, you have a presumption of compliance to the requirement of the quality system for the MDDs and MDRs. The same for the risk management for 14971. It is a way to demonstrate compliance, but it's not the only one. You could have a quality system that does not comply to 13485. Now, in Europe, it's pretty difficult. But in the US, the certification to 13485 is not a requirement. And the same thing for 14971, 62304, they are not really mandatory. In practice, they are, but they are not. But it will be up to you then to demonstrate that the system that you put together, although it is not compliant to these standards, is still compliant to the laws, but it makes things way, way more difficult. And that's why they're used for this presumption of compliance. But remember that if you then you have a problem, you have an audit, ultimately what they're looking into is the compliance with the law. Right, now we're gonna give a look at the road for a company from basically the beginning to having a product on the market. So I had to patch the head of that character, of course, so I couldn't copy it, and that, of course, is me. This is kind of at a very, very high level, the path to compliance, starting from basically the beginning. You need to set up a quality system. Now, here we're talking about the regulatory aspects of the process. Of course, you need to have a device as well, or at least an idea for the device. Then you go for certification, if required, like certification to 13485 or the MDSAP or things like that. You develop your product in parallel, not necessarily these things are just like sequential, they could be done in parallel. When everything is ready, go for submission and approval. Then the product is on the market at this point. And then the whole processes, the post-market processes kick off, the surveillance in case of problems, and the change management, because things keep on changing. We are not going to cover everything today. Of course, this is going to take hours and more, but we're going to give a look at how you start this product, this process, okay? You probably have an idea of how to develop your product, of course. Certification, there are a lot of information about that. Let's give a look at how you actually start from all of this. So the quality management system, what is a quality management system? And then at the moment, I took this information straight from ISO 9000, not 8001, 9000. So quality management system is a set of interactive, interrelated elements of an organization to establish, polish, and objective and processes to achieve this objective, and it is related, of course, to quality. Okay, great. What does it mean in practice? So you see the triangle there. This is the typical representation of the structure of a quality system. Now, this is a way to represent it, and not necessarily is composed by only 4 elements. You can break it down, merge the way you want, but this is kind of the generic structure, kind of the basic structure. What is it? Start with a quality policy. It's a statement that includes a commitment to comply with requirements and to maintain the effectiveness of the quality management system, provides a framework for establishing and reviewing quality objectives. This is from 1345. So these are the 2 basic requirements to put together a quality system, the quality policy. Then the rest of the content, the way you want to structure it is up to you. Some companies, most companies consider it as kind of an exercise, but it's kind of, it should be the expression of how the managers intends to comply to the applicable standard and regulation, and how this is then intended to be implemented in the company. A level down, if you want to say that, is the quality manual. So it should include 4 things: the scope and the justification, in particular what is included and what is not included. So exclusion and non-applicabilities. Because not everything that, for example, in 1345 is applicable to you. If it talks about sterile devices and your device is not sterile, that is not applicable. The documented procedure for the quality management system references them. So in theory, the quality system could be everything. You can have your manual that thick that contains absolutely every procedure, everything. In practice, it is not what is done. The quality manual becomes sort of a pointer, a summary of your quality system. And then you get finally to the core. You have the procedure, which is a specified way to carry out an activity or a process. So it's more about a process, okay? Now, procedure can be a very high level, can be a very low level. That some companies have work instructions that are more technical, that specify how to carry out very specific tasks, or you can have a very high level procedures that talk about how to develop the product in general. And then you have templates and records. So templates is a structured document that, when filled in, becomes a record. So quality policy, manual, procedure, templates, they sit there, your gold object that are somewhere in your system. People access them, people use them, they read them. And when they have to document that they have carried out something, if required, they take these templates, they fill them in, they get approved, and then they become a record. Okay, the records are considered documents for the classification of 1335. All of these are documents, but records are a very specific type of document. We are not going to get into the details here. Right. So documentation management. How do you manage all the documentation? Yes. If you don't want to go basically, well, you can go paper-based. It's absolutely fine. It works absolutely fine. Is it a bit unpractical in 2021, considering all the level of technology and automation that we can have? But the requirements are that we're going to cover at least a very high level today are the ones in 1345 and 10 CFR 820. So US and ISO World. So why do we have this requirement? Because you need to make sure that these documents comply to certain principle of availability, that when they are updated are managed in a certain way, that they are preserved, so they're still readable or they're still accessible by people, that they are approved in a certain way, and it's just not somebody just pushes a document and people start using it without too much control. Going into the details, 1345 and 21 CFR 20 share a lot of requirements, but there are some of them that are slightly different. So what does it say? That you have to review and approve this document prior to releasing them. Pretty obvious. If you want to change them, then have to be reviewed, updated, and reapproved. This is the life cycle of a document. Just skipping to the last point, the prevention of unintended use of obsolete documents, and it's very important. So if an old version or a document that you decide that is not usable, is not useful anymore, it has to be obsoleted and retired from use. And what has happened, are the characteristics of this document that must be preserved? So if there are changes, the revision status and the change must be identified. So they must have a change history. There must be available point of use. What's the point of having a great quality system if then nobody can use it? It can't just be there and that's it. They have to remain legible and identifiable. Now, this was more applicable probably to paper system, but even when you talk about software and electronic records, you have to consider that these they can be corrupted, they can be lost, so you need to put something in place. Documents of external origin must be controlled too, so you are supposed to have a copy of these standards, and if there is someone in your company who needs to use it, they must be able to find it and use it. So they typically are managed in a similar way. And of course, prevent the deterioration of those document, which kind of again refers to the availability, legibility, and the preservation of the documents. 21 CFR 20.40 has very similar requirement, but it gives its kind of spin to this requirement. So in terms of approval and distribution, it points to the fact that people who reapprove changes to a document should be not necessarily the same people, but people of the same group. So if the first version of a document was approved by R&D and manufacturing, the version 2 can't really be approved by marketing and sales. It doesn't make sense. It says that, of course, the approval should include the date and the signature of the person. And of course, talks about obsolete documents. For changes, we cover the fact that they have to be approved by the same function organization, not necessarily the same people. You need to tell people that this has happened. You need to let people know, hey, this has changed because this could have impacted what they are doing on the day-to-day activities. The change description here goes a little bit more into detail. It talks about the identification of the affected document, the signature of the people, the data, and when the change becomes effective. So it kind of gives a little bit of, it allows you to have something that approved but not effective. Right, there is also a very interesting part of the Code of Federal Regulation, namely 21 CFR 11, about electronic records, electronic signatures, who talks about documents in electronic format. There is nothing like that in Europe, or as far as I know, in any other places in the world like this one. And although it does, I think it was introduced in the 70s, it's pretty demanding. It's pretty intense if you want to fully comply to 21 CFR 11. It can give you a lot of headaches. So electronic records and electronic signatures. Electronic records is like a document, but it doesn't have to be a document, necessarily only a document that is stored in a computer system. Okay, but this is not just a document. It could be data, it could be a software, it could be a picture, it could be anything that is stored in digital format. And electronic signature is, of course, the equivalent, the electronic equivalent of a handwritten signature, which doesn't mean that it is a scanned copy of your signatures. It means that it is something that belongs to you and only you can apply. This is the concept, but it doesn't have to look like a signature. It could be a blurb of bits and bytes that are embedded in a page. So it's not a scanned version of your signature. Right. Right. It is structured like a wiki, so it means that it doesn't have the typical format of documents and folders, but it has these things called spaces that are like folder and pages that are like document, with the difference that pages can be have children. So a page can be an object, a document, or can be a folder, or both. And also the fact that there is no real pagination, so a document is just a continuous list of information. If you export it in Word or PDF, it will then have pages, but when you visualize it, just a continuous set of information, like Wikipedia, basically. That's why they're called wikis. So Let's give a look at how we structure that. We have our own quality system, which means that we can provide the static content. So everything that we're talking about, the procedures, the quality manual, the quality policies, the templates. We have our own version that complies to different regulations. It's static, meaning that you just import it or you just download it, and then you own these objects. They become your own quality system. There is a little bit of customization that has to be made, and we spoke about that earlier, meaning that, for example, you have to describe what your exclusions are, the non-applicability. If there are things, if you're not interested in certain regulations or certain areas of the world, you can remove them. But this is based on the structure of 13485. So the vast majority of the content of this object is applicable regardless of where you are in the world and regardless of type of device that you deal with or you're developing. Of course, we have the quality policy. We have a number of guidance documents that can help in certain areas of the process, in certain processes, but they are not intended to be control documents. Use them if you want. And we have a change history because we typically push updates every 3 to 6 months, depending on what's happening in the field. At the moment, after the introduction of the MDR and the update to 14971, it's a period of relative calm. The next thing that should happen is an update of 6234. And one day, the FDA said that they will align their quality system to 13485, but they have just missed another deadline. They keep on pushing out. They just don't have the capacity to do it. It's a serious attempt and it's the right thing to do, but they just don't have the capacity, especially in these times of, when they had budget cuts, depending on the different depending on the different governments and who was in power, the Democrats or the Republicans, and also because of the COVID, this is definitely not the highest priority right now. We have a number of procedures, about 20 right now, that they cover everything that is just quality system. So the processes that we were talking about earlier. The core process, what we defined as the core process of this of our product, is this device lifecycle SOP, which is the basically product development or also called design controls. And this is a procedure. It's quite extensive because it includes also the requirement of 6234. So if you have software or if your product is software only, then this is definitely applicable. It is also written at a relatively low level. So we're trying to help companies that are at the beginning of the process that not necessarily have a lot of knowledge or experience in internal experience in medical device to hit the ground, not necessarily running, but not, spend a lot of time trying to set up this system from scratch. One of the major problems that we are seeing, what everybody's seeing out there, is that some companies go through the whole development process of their product, and towards the end they say, great, now let's put together the documentation, make it a medical device. It doesn't really work like that. It's extremely painful if you get to that point, because doing all these things retrospectively, it's very hard. It's difficult. It takes longer, and you always end up seeing that you have to make changes to your product. So you have to start as soon as possible putting together the basic documentation for your product. Even if the product, if the system is not live, and even if it's not certified, it doesn't matter. Start putting down or start filling in these documents. We have an extensive list of templates. So for every phase of the project, there is a minimum number of documents that you have to put together. Start immediately, and this will save you an enormous amount of time further down the line. These documents are intended to be constantly updated. Things change. You make a plan, things change. You have to update your plans. You have to update your requirements. You have to update your risk analysis and so forth. But start earlier. This will save you a lot of time and pain down the line. We also have a couple of procedures that are more regulatory focused, like labeling a UDI and the regulatory process SOP. So they're relatively high level because we don't pretend that we can put in a procedure all the possible law that you can have in Europe or in the US and Canada. So this is just a help to navigate their system, and starting from the basics things like what are the classification in the different parts of the world, what are the requirements for the quality system, how do you register, how do you submit an application, what are the processes for post-market, how do you communicate changes, how do you report issues, things like that. So starting really from the basic stuff, but this is something that will help you navigate, because there is a lot in terms of laws out there. And then, as I said, we have a bunch of templates, about 67 templates right now, but they cover every part of the system, of course, all the required records, and the majority of them is again focused on products. Our quality system is focused on companies that are the beginning of this process, so it's not necessarily suited for companies that are, for example, at the very end of their development, or they are established, they've had a product in the market for a long time. So just to show you one of them, you have this software development plan, and the software development plan, although these are templates, we are still trying to put in as much content as possible to help users and to help developers put together their documentation, because yeah, you can give all the guidance that you want in a procedure, but yeah, when you open a template, it's really nice to have like some sort of guidance, examples, and things like that built into the template itself. So you can see that even if this is a template or something that you have to put together, depending on the type of your device, depending on your device, there's still a good bit of content already in that will help you a lot. Now, this is the static content, the boring part of the system. Well, even the rest is probably not very exciting, but it's definitely a bit more dynamic. Now, how do you automate all of this? Because yes, great, you have these electronic records electronically, but what about electronic signature? So we use a couple of add-ons from a company that is very established in this sector. They're called MedTech. This is the quality system that we just looked at. This is the Confluence, so this is what we are in. We use MedTech. They have two add-ons. They're used for workflows, electronic signature, but they are very generic. You can purchase them out of the box, off the shelf, there's no problem, but they're very generic. They're not specifically for any type of industry or any type of application. So we do a heavy customization of all of these. We create spaces, we set them up, we install new workflows so that you have a starting point. But all of this is completely flexible and open to you. There is nothing that is locked down, nothing that really belongs to us. From day one, you are, and we recommend that you take control of your system. You can start if necessary, start modify. You can add workflows, you can change the workflow, you can change the procedure templates, you can do absolutely whatever you want. Now, very quickly, how does it work? Now, we created a bunch of different spaces for different applications for certain specific records. The typical one, other than the quality system itself, are change requests, CAPA non-conformities, generic records, an example of how to manage requirements, standard training, so specification, and so forth. But in some cases, we have two spaces that manage the same object. For example, quality system, you have a draft space and a publish, so-called publish space. So the publish space is where everybody has access to in the company. People go there when they have to use the quality system, find the template, find the procedure, and so forth. But in the background, you have this quality system draft, and this is where we were at the beginning, where not everybody has access, but who has access can change the content and can route it for new approval. This is required to comply with one of the requirements that we've seen earlier. People should only see the most up-to-date version of a document. So people will see only the latest approved version, while in the background, somebody else can be working on the next version. So the generic user will not be able to see the draft, it will not be able to see obsolete documents, will not be able to see previous version. And this is exactly how we should be working. So I'm just going to create we're not going to go into the details of how Confluence works, because there could be hours spent here in terms of all the feature. Let's see that this is a test procedure. I just put some test content. It's called publishing, but this button here basically means save. And you can see that there are workflows that automatically take control of this object. It says they put it in draft. Different spaces have different workflows for different things. And the system says that this is new, meaning that you're working on something that is new, has never been published prior to that. So the way it works, like we're going to go through the different steps, but just to show you in general how this works. From draft, it goes in review, where you can invite people to review this document. People can collaborate. There is actually a very good feature for concurrent collaboration, meaning that you can have like as many users as you want working on the same document at the same time, and you can see live what somebody else is doing. It's really, really good. When everybody's happy, they click, yeah, reviewed, job done, let's move on, and it goes into formal approval. Again, you can invite as many people as you want as approvers. The way to approve it is, and this is where we're talking about this electronic signature that of 21 CFR 11. So it is something that has to be it's like electronics, it's like the physical signature. It is something that only you know and only you can apply. So it's the credential, basically. It starts with an identifier, so your email. And sorry if I'm looking at the phone, but I needed to get the token. And then in this case, you can use an authenticator. There are different ones that you can use. You pair the authenticator with this add-on and with Confluence. You will get a token. And this is used instead of your password. So this is very secure because even if you can see my token in 30 seconds, that token will be gone. So this is the thing that defines this and ensures that this is an actual valid electronic signature. And then the next step, when everything is proved, is the training. So we haven't really covered that, but when you release a document, such a procedure, you have to make sure that people are trained to it before they actually start using it. Training could be as simple as read it, understand it. A lot of the time, that just it doesn't have to be quizzes or classroom training or things like that. It works like the previous step. So you assign it to people. People put in their username, their email and the token. With the difference is that in this case, the meaning is different. It's meaning that you have read and understood, and you have a time to complete it, which is typically 2 weeks. This is not written anywhere. This is kind of a standard, but it could be more, it could be less. It's totally to you, but it can't last forever. The only requirement here, the real requirement here from the regulation and from the standards is that people must be trained before they use this procedure, okay? So, but how can you ensure that they are trained before they use it? You have to put a time at the deadline here. That's the only way. Anyway, when everybody has trained and you can publish it, then just with a click of a button, this is automatically copied in the target space. So now people will see only this approved version. Now it says that it's synced here, meaning that I have a copy here, but I also have a copy in the published space, and the content is identical. Okay, it's not new anymore. If I edit it, people that have visibility of the published space will not be able to see what I'm doing. So at the moment it's synced. I have a link that goes to the published version, so you can see that I'm changing space here, and it brings me to the published version of this object. So of course it is identical, and it's pretty simple. Here there is no workflow because this is just a very static space where people just log in. As I said, they see these procedures or template and they use them as they are. I'm going back now to my the source version, so the draft space, and I edit it. So if I edit it, Confluence will create a new version of this object. Confluence works like that. Instead of like a file on your computer where if you want to make a new version, you typically copy a file, you rename it, and then you copy it again for another version. Confluence stacks them one on top of the other. So you have a page and you will see only the latest approved version, or if you're here, you say the latest draft. And below that, you have all the history of this object. I think it's way more practical than having different files. Now, I'm just editing it, so as a Confluence will create a new version. The workflow realized that something has changed, and they will put this object in draft. Sorry, I'll just update it so it will go back to draft. What happens here is that if I go to my spaces and if I go to my quality system, the content of this document has not changed. So it means that, of course, I as a user can still work on the latest approved version, while someone in the background may actually be working on a new version. And this is actually how it works.